So hi everyone, my name is Jodie and I'll be presenting on Fisher Ecological Knowledge on spawning locations of Argyrosomus japonicus, also dusky cob, along the South African coastline. So Argyrosomus japonicus is found globally, mainly in the Indo-Pacific region, from South Africa to Australia and Japan, and it is globally threatened and is facing conservation threats. So dusky cob form vulnerable spawning aggregations that are large, predictable gatherings of mature fish to reproduce. But these aggregations are heavily targeted by fishers, and they are currently also facing threats from overfishing, climate change, and habitat loss. So dusky cob in South Africa are an ecologically and economically important species. We know from Griffith's 1996 that spawning happens from August to November in KwaZulu-Natal and October to January in the Eastern and Western Cape. And these aggregations are heavily targeted by fishers. So one of the main challenges in managing dusky cob here is we do not know enough about when and where spawning happens. We risk missing key locations that contribute to recruitment. And without these sites, our conservation strategies like marine protected areas and seasonal closures remain less effective. This all aligns with the cob conservation strategy, which is a 10-year collaborative plan focusing on halting the decline of the cob species and guiding their recovery. So one of the fundamental challenges is that dusky cob have two very similar species, square-tailed cob and silver cob. They are very difficult to distinguish between, and as they don't have many taxonomic characteristics that distinguish them. Only smell, pectoral fin length, presence of scales in the pectoral fin fold, curvature of lateral line, eye diameter, and drumming muscles. So one of the main challenges in my research is if I'm going to use Fisher ecological knowledge to identify spawning locations, how can I trust that these fishes can correctly distinguish dusky cob from the other cob species? So this is what I needed to address first. So Fisher ecological knowledge refers to the observations and experiences that fishers build over time through direct interactions with the ecosystem and the species. It is becoming increasingly used in fisheries research because it's cost effective and it can provide an understanding on species behavior and spawning patterns. So the aim of my project was to use FEK to identify spawning locations of dusky cob along the South African coastline, with the objectives of documenting fish observations of spawning events, evaluating the validity of these observations, and identifying spatial and temporal patterns. So I developed an online survey in Question Pro and was distributed from June to August of last year on Facebook and WhatsApp fishing groups. We received 315 responses from shore-based anglers, ski-boat anglers, and spear fishermen. My analysis focused on angler specialization scoring, validation of identification ability, validation of these spawning observations, and mapping these spawning observations for spatial and temporal patterns. So a bit about the respondent demographic. So of the 315 responses, majority of my respondents came from the Southeastern Cape region, with shore-based angling being the most common fishing method, followed by boat-based angling. And most of my respondents had 20 to 35 years of experience, so I captured an experienced group of anglers. But not all anglers have the same level of ecological knowledge, so they range from generalists who are casual participants to specialists who are highly motivated and skilled. And we measured these specialization through 3 indicators: avidity, how frequently they fish, skilled, and centrality to life, how important fishing was on their lifestyle. So using a specialization scoring system, we categorized our respondents. So our highly specialized were scoring 18 and above, which we had 36 respondents. Moderately specialized, we had 124, and then we only had 1 respondent that was classified as not specialized. And this is important because in other FEK studies, the highly specialized anglers typically had better ecological knowledge. So this is where things get a bit challenging. Because I'm using I needed to validate my spawning observations. We first needed to assess whether they could distinguish dusky cob. So this is a table showing the taxonomic characteristics that separate the dusky cob: the smell, the pectoral fin length, the presence of scales in the pectoral fin fold, curvature of lateral line, eye diameter, and drumming muscles. And this just shows all the characteristic differences between dusky cob, silver cob, and square-tailed cob. And this was all from Griffith's 1996. So here's what anglers actually used. So this is a chart showing the salience index on how frequently the different characteristics that were mentioned by the anglers. You can see that color, tail shape, and body shape were the most frequently mentioned characteristics, but these are not the diagnostic characteristics that can actually distinguish the species. Color, well, the actual diagnostic characteristics are highlighted in orange, and smell was by far the most frequently mentioned, but far less than the actual diagnostic characteristics that separate these species. Oh, sorry, wrong button. So we developed a 3-step decision tree to validate whether these individuals could correctly identify dusky cob. So our most surprising finding is that 85% of the respondents could not distinguish dusky cob from the other cob species. We did this by seeing if they could state a taxonomic characteristic. So that's 269 of the 315 respondents could not distinguish dusky cob. After a further evaluation, 10 respondents were classified as likely able to identify a dusky cob, and 20 as maybe able to identify a dusky cob. So we would expect the highly specialized anglers to have better species identification ability, but this graph shows that there is no relationship between specialization and taxonomic knowledge. So even these specialized anglers could not correctly distinguish dusky cob from the other cob species using the taxonomic characteristics. And this differs significantly from all the other studies that I read that stated better specialization had a better ecological knowledge. So despite these identification challenges, we received 37 spawning observations, and after a vigorous validation criteria, we classified 11 respondents as likely a dusky cob and another 14 as maybe a dusky cob. So we had a total of 25 valid spawning observations to work with. So we mapped these spawning observations, and we got multiple clusters in southern KwaZulu-Natal with over 51% of all spawning observations in this area. There are multiple clusters in the Umtumzini, Tugela Mouth, Umkomas, and Port Shepstone areas. Southern Cape also showed clusters in the Argyrosomus and Stilbaai areas. However, northern KwaZulu-Natal and the Wild Coast had very limited observations. However, river mouths also appear to be critical spawning habitats across all regions. There were clear seasonal patterns that emerged. Southern KwaZulu-Natal had winter and spring spawning through August to November, and Southern Cape had summer spawning from November to December. The southeastern case, however, had very scattered observations with no clear patterns. And you can see that the arrows indicate Griffith's findings from 1996. So there's clear overlapping, which is quite amazing. So 85% of my respondents could not distinguish dusky cob from the other cob species. And then we had a weak correlation between angler specialization and the taxonomic knowledge of anglers, so this differs from a lot of other studies. However, we had 35 spawning observations with a total of 25 validated observations, and clear spatial and temporal patterns emerged that aligned remarkably well with Griffith's 1996 work. Southern KwaZulu-Natal had winter and spring spawning, and Southern Cape had summer spawning. And new potential spawning sites were identified, particularly in the Southern Cape where there are no documented sites. And Southern KwaZulu-Natal showed to be a major spawning area with multiple clusters, and the river mouths appear to be critical spawning habitats. So this all has large implications on dusky cob conservation. Currently, the cob conservation strategy is based on 2 known spawning locations, but our data shows a much bigger cluster of spawning locations, particularly in the Southern KwaZulu-Natal, and new spawning locations in the Southern Cape that have not been documented. And they also show that river mouths are critical spawning habitats. There is a proposed close season in KwaZulu-Natal from August to October, but it has not yet been implemented. And with 51% of all spawning observations in this area, it shows how critical it is to protect spawning during this time in this big major spawning area. In November to January, we propose a closed season in the Southern Cape to protect spawning during this time, as we see those new spawning locations. And these spawning aggregations are large, predictable, and easily targeted gatherings, so closures during these peak spawning times will protect this ecologically and economically important species. I'd like to thank the NRF ASAP grant for funding this project, Department of Ichthyology and Fishery Science, Safer Lab, World Direct for funding my attendance, and the 315 fishes for their information.
Thanks, Jodie. So we've got about 5 minutes for questions. So any questions from the floor?
Just one observation, not observation, Jodie. But did you know that Mark Griffiths took 1 year longer to complete his PhD than what he should have?
I did not know.
No? Do you know the reason why? No.
No?
Because 7 months down the line, we suspected that there is a difference between what he was collecting from the shore and what he was collecting from Port Alfred. And one day we went down to Port Alfred and we asked the fishermen, here's local ecological knowledge, we asked the fishermen, what's the difference? Because we are seeing some fish are maturing here around about 30 centimeters and others at 90. So they said to me, Prof, have you smelt them? The one stinks and the other one doesn't stink. And the one that doesn't stink, that's why it's got its name Inodorus. Just a little history. But that's local ecological knowledge that saved the day.
Yeah, actually, to follow up on that, cool talk. So a lot of fishers, you know, they may not know exactly what taxonomic trait they're looking at, but they just like the collection of the trait when they look at the fish is how they can identify it. Did you try to do like these misidentifications? Did you try to do any like validations with fishers?
Yeah, so we validated them. We looked at, so they got asked to give an open-ended question on how they would distinguish dusky cob from the other cob species. We asked where they fish mainly, how their most common fishing method, and that's how we used to distinguish if it was a dusky cob and validate what it was. Because dusky cob are more commonly found along the shore, or they would more commonly find them on the shoreline, and depends the areas as well and the time of year. So we did validate as much as we could.
Did you ever like go out with anybody and like, is that a dusky cob?
No, sadly I could not.
Thanks, Jodie. It was a good talk. Given the fact that 85% of anglers can't identify between the three different cob species, how useful are any of our management measures for different cob species, and what would be a way to work through that?
So from my knowledge, they're based on area. The current management strategies are based on area, but there's currently all three species have overlapping distributions. So I think to help with that, I think workshops and getting anglers to understand what actually distinguishes the three species from each other would be very useful.
Thanks for the talk. I'm just curious to know how your specialization scores, what criteria, is it just based on their ability to identify carp, or
No, so the specialization was on avidity questions, so how frequently they fish, skill, and their centrality to life, so how important fishing was on their lifestyle. So it's a set bunch of questions from Brian, 1977. I could be corrected on that though.
Yeah, thanks. Just follow up on the management. I mean, wouldn't it then make more sense to have the same, for example, minimum size limit for all of them, or are they so vastly different?
So they do, all three species slightly do mature at different ages, and they do have different distributions, so that's how they currently are done at the moment. They're currently managed as one unit, one species. Yes.
Can I comment on that?
If I'm wrong, sorry.
Yeah, what happens is that approximately 95 to 97% of the catch of Inodorus is caught at sea. They don't occur on the shore. Very few. Whereas japonicus is a fish which you catch along the shore in the Southern Cape, in the Eastern Cape, in the town you catch them offshore. So the regulations that have been developed take that into account. So, for example, if you are out at sea in this part of the country, you're not allowed to say, for example, bring back a cob which is less than X. Whereas if you catch one on the shore, it should not be smaller than 60. Whereas the other one is smaller than something like 70 or something. So the regulation is pretty well defined, and that's largely, of course, of where the fish occur.
Just a quick one, Jodie. I'm quite interested. Did you give them the feedback that the specialists didn't know how to identify the fish? How did they take that?
So the fishing groups that I sent it to, a lot of them asked for their end of year meetings and that. And they found it very interesting how like 85% of them couldn't identify. I didn't get much feedback from a lot of them. I sent through a report.
Yeah.
I got heard back from one or two. They were very interested and they asked me questions and asked to send through stuff.
Yeah, it's a good feedback loop to improving education, isn't it?
Yes.
Thank you, Jodie.